First of all, if you love stories filled with emotion, faith, and twists that touch the soul, subscribe to my channel now. I'm Wyatt McCall, and I can promise you one thing. If you stay with me until the end, you'll have an experience that might change the way you view love, forgiveness, and miracles. And do me a favor? Write in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I want to know how far this story will resonate. Now, hold on tight, because what I'm about to tell you about Jacob Miller isn't just a story. It's a calling. Jacob crossed the Bozeman border with a tight chest, as if the icy wind of that late autumn was ripping away his last certainties. His family's old ranch loomed on the horizon, half disappeared among the bare trees and dry pastures. He coughed hard, leaning against the steering wheel of his truck. The doctor in Chicago had been clear. Advanced cancer. Months, maybe weeks, no chance. But Jacob hadn't come to fight. He'd come to accept. Or so he thought. He stopped before. The wooden gate which creaked at the slightest breath. The knife-carved initials JM were still there, half covered by moss and dust. Everything was the same, and yet completely different. The house with its peeling paint, the crooked barn, the screaming silence. It was as if time had stopped since he'd left, and now it was waiting for him to face what he'd left behind. Jacob took a deep breath, forced the gate open, and the sound of the wood creaking echoed like an omen. The porch floor creaked beneath his boots. The windows were closed, but he knew where the key was. Behind the cracked vase, under the heart-shaped stone. His mother had always left it there. He picked it up, opened the door, and the smell of aged wood filled his chest with a vengeance. It was the smell of childhood, of pancake breakfasts, of Christmases filled with laughter and prayer, of the time when he believed in God, and that God believed in him. Sitting on the living room's tattered sofa, Jacob stared at the painting, hanging on the wall. A psalm in embroidered letters. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. He smiled bitterly. The shadow was already within him. The ranch was just the final scene. But there was something strange about that night. Something he couldn't explain. As if he were being watched. Not in a threatening way, but as if someone was waiting. The next morning, light flooded the room unceremoniously. And with it, a note pinned to the door with a rusty nail. He heard no one, saw nothing, but the note was there. Welcome back. Home remembers. So does heaven. Unsigned. Jacob frowned. He had no friends here. Not since he'd left in a fight with his father before his death. Who could have left that? The handwriting was feminine, firm, and the scent. It was like lavender and warm bread. With the basket in his hands. Yes, there was a basket with bread, jam, and an old Bible. Jacob sat on the porch and stared out at the field. The cold was biting, but he didn't move. He just stared. He wondered if he was losing his mind, if it was the effect of the medication, or if the ranch was trying to speak to him, because something there vibrated differently. And he knew it. He could feel it, even if he didn't want to admit it. The ranch wasn't just land. It was an altar, and something was alive. On the third day, he heard the voice, soft, almost like a song. Jacob? He turned slowly and saw a woman with a serene posture, golden hair tied back in a navy scarf, eyes steady as the sky before a storm. Abigail rose. She held a book and a basket. You don't know me, but I knew your mother. I cared for her these last months. Time stood still, and something inside him trembled. She didn't wait for permission. She sat beside him on the porch, as if that were her place too, and she began to talk about faith, about the woman her mother became after he left, about the prayers said on that porch, about promises that don't break, even when the person leaves. Abigail had a peace that was unsettling, because it was as if she knew something he didn't, something no one knew, something that was about to happen. That night, Jacob dreamed of his father, but he wasn't the father he'd seen when he'd left, angry and disappointed. He was the young, strong father, kneeling in the pasture, praying with tears in his eyes. And in the background, the figure of a woman in a white veil, whispering something he couldn't hear. Upon waking, Jacob felt the pain in his chest ease for a few seconds. It wasn't physical relief. It was as if he'd been touched. But by whom? Or why? And that's when, my friend, things begin to change. Because what happened after that morning ... challenged everything Jacob believed. And you'll want to see it for yourself. So stay tuned. The silence of that house was like a mirror. It showed everything Jacob was trying to forget. Every floorboard creaked with memories he didn't want to relive. The broken fence seemed like an echo of his father's last conversation. The dust on the piano in the corner of the living room, his mother's unanswered letters. And even as he hammered nails in the barn, chopped wood, or cleaned the water tank, it was as if the ghosts were watching him, demanding explanations he no longer had. The strength to give. The days slipped by like the dry Montana wind. Time that didn't pass it weighed heavily. Jacob cleaned the ranch with the precision of someone trying to redeem sins with each sweep of the broom. When he found something from his childhood, like a portrait or an old high school baseball cap, he stopped instinctively, but not because of longing. He stopped because of the tightness in his chest. It was the memory of who was gone, and the guilt of who didn't stay. He fled before his father's last breath. And now, with cancer eating away at his days, perhaps, he had also fled from God. The old radio still worked, but Jacob didn't turn it on. The sound of loneliness was already too loud. He wrote little, spoke less. Sometimes he thought of Abigail, of that brief visit, of the way she spoke of his mother, so tenderly. But he pushed those thoughts away as if they were dangerous. He didn't want ties. He didn't want hope. He just wanted everything to end in peace. But even that didn't seem easy. One gray afternoon, rain threatened, and Jacob decided to repair the barn roof. He climbed the ladder, leaning on prayers and nails. The wind blew hard and nearly knocked him over. He cursed loudly, catching himself at the last moment, his entire body trembling. That was when he felt a sharp pain in his abdomen. Sharp, cutting. He almost crawled down the ladder. Sitting on the dirt floor, his forehead sweating cold, he stared at the overcast sky and for the first time in years, whispered, "If there's anyone still up there, then show me now." The answer didn't come from the sky. It came from the sound of a car approaching. The headlights cut through the fog, and Jacob slowly stood up. It was a blue pickup truck, old but well kept. And when the door opened, he knew loneliness no longer ruled here. Abigail got out in a lilac dress and a dark wool coat, holding a basket covered in a crocheted cloth. But this time, she didn't smile. There was concern in her eyes, as if she knew his pain before he even told her. "You look pale," she said, approaching slowly. Jacob tried to hide it, forcing a neutral tone, just out of habit with the mountain air. She didn't laugh at his bad joke. She just stared at him with steady eyes, and then, without asking permission, placed the basket on the hood of the truck. "I brought soup. And one question. Are you going to keep pretending you're alone? In this world?" Jacob remained silent, because he no longer knew how to lie with his eyes. Inside the house, the smell of soup mingled with the aroma of burning wood and damp wood. Abigail paced the kitchen as if she'd grown up there. She served them both without ceremony, pulled out a chair and waited. Jacob finally sat at the table. "Why do you do this?" he asked. "Why do you care?" She lowered her eyes for a second and answered with a simplicity that broke something inside him. "Because your mother taught me to love those who need it most, even when they don't want it." That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in his father's chair, staring into the fire, Abigail's note in his hand. He remembered when, at age 12, he fell from his horse and cried out in pain. His father ran, but his mother knelt beside him, prayed with him, and the pain ceased. He never forgot it, but over time, he called it a coincidence. Today, he no longer knew what was real, but Abigail's gaze. That was too real to ignore. The next dawn, the ranch seemed more alive. The birds began to sing. Again, the pain had subsided. He chopped wood for hours, cleaned the well, fed the horses as if he were being reborn. But upon entering the house, he saw something that made him freeze. On the fireplace mantelpiece sat a white rose, alive, impossible. For the station, he hadn't placed it there, and Abigail hadn't been there since last night. The question hung in the air like perfume. Who or what had left that sign? And so I ask you, do you believe in coincidences? Because what Jacob thought was the end was only the beginning. Loneliness was surrendering, but what was yet to come was something he never dared to dream. And you, who are listening to me now, will want to witness it. So stay tuned. Part 3 will reveal what happens when this heart begins to open, even when the mind is still at war. Some people enter our lives like a bolt of lightning, but others enter like a seed, and their presence is so subtle that you only notice it when your heart begins to blossom. Abigail Rose was like that. She made no noise when she arrived. She didn't demand space, but wherever she stepped, something silent blossomed. Jacob hadn't been the same since she crossed that threshold, and though he tried to deny it, his soul had already recognized something in her that his mind still resisted accepting. That morning, she appeared again, unannounced. She brought fresh eggs, a small bouquet of lavender, and 2 still warm loaves of bread wrapped in plaid. But what caught your attention most wasn't what she carried. It was the way she looked. Abigail had those eyes that never asked permission to enter. They saw deep inside, even when you tried to hide it. "I brought coffee, and listen," she said with a smile. "You choose which one you want first." Jacob laughed awkwardly. It was rare for him to laugh, too rare. And Abigail noticed, but didn't comment. They sat on the porch like an old farm couple, even though they weren't yet. The wind blew the dry leaves, and the silence was comfortable. "Did you know your mother prayed for you every morning?" Abigail asked, even when she didn't get an answer. Jacob lowered his eyes. The guilt still throbbed. "I knew she prayed, but I didn't know she continued to pray after everything." She nodded slowly. "She never stopped believing in you. She said true love doesn't require anything in return, only presence, even if it's only in spirit." Jacob took a deep breath, trying to hold back what no longer fit inside. "I walked away from everything. From her, from myself, from God." Abigail didn't move. She just placed her hand over his, her touch light, almost ethereal. "But he never walked away from you, Jacob. Never. Sometimes his silence is just to better hear our pain." That afternoon, they picked apples together. The trees, which had previously been dry, now bore shy fruit. Abigail joked that it was the ranch trying to impress her. Jacob, still suspicious of miracles, thought it was luck or rain. But inside him, a strange spark began to burn. Something he thought had died. Something that was reborn every time she smiled or whispered his name at the end of the day. She took a handkerchief from her pocket and wiped his forehead. "You're burning," she said. "You need to rest." But Jacob held her wrist for a moment. "Why do you care so much? Why do you give so much?" She was silent. The sunset tinted her eyes gold, and the breeze blew her loose hair behind her ear. Then she answered, her voice breaking, "Because no one cared when I needed it most. And your mother was the only one who saw me." It was true. Abigail had arrived in Bozeman a widow, with nothing, a grief that had nowhere to be buried. And Elizabeth Miller, even in her own grief, reached out. She taught her to plant, to pray silently, to warm others even on cold nights. "I thought I would never love anyone again," Abigail said, staring out at the field. "But now, I'm not sure anymore." Jacob didn't answer, but in that moment, the world seemed to stop for a second. And in that second, everything changed. As they said goodbye, Abigail rested her face on his shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but Jacob felt his heart skip a beat. And for the first time since receiving his diagnosis, he feared dying. Not from the pain, but from leaving without knowing what could have been. Without knowing if there was still time to love and be loved. He wanted to say something, but could only whisper, "Come back tomorrow?" And she, with a calm smile, replied, "God willing, and I think he does." That night, he lit a fire and picked up the Bible she'd left days ago. He opened it without thinking. He landed on Psalms. He healed the brokenhearted and bound up their wounds. Jacob closed his eyes. Tears flowed. It was as if each verse had been written for him, as if his pain had been anticipated and understood. And silently, he whispered his first sincere prayer in years. "I don't know how to go back, but if you are there, teach me." Outside, the white rose still sat on the fireplace, untouched, alive. The wind gently blew the curtain. And for a brief moment, Jacob was sure he smelled his mother's perfume in the air. He didn't know it yet, but the true miracle had already begun. And you, listening to this with me, get ready, because what comes next ... will move you. In the next chapter, faith will be tested, and love put to the test. Don't miss it. Part 4 will leave your soul in suspense. It was as if the ranch had waited all these years to finally speak. Jacob walked through the old barn, now partially cleaned, as if entering sacred ground. The smell of old hay, damp wood, and rust was the same as it had been decades ago. But there was something in the air he didn't remember, a soft weight, an invisible presence. Moving a chest of broken tools, he discovered a wooden box, delicately carved and with a small cross on the latch. He didn't remember it, but his name was engraved on the lid for Jacob when ready. His hands trembled as he opened them. Inside were letters, many letters, all written by his mother and none sent. Some were dated 5-7 years ago, others more recent. Letters written in a handwriting that grew shakier, weaker, but they all carried the same tone. Hope. Hope that he would return. That God would. Bring him back not just to the ranch, but to his faith. Jacob read silently, until one sentence in particular made him pause. "The miracle I asked for wasn't for me. It was for you." He leaned his forehead against the barn wall and wept silently. There was no one else there, just him and the echo of the words of a mother who believed until the end. But it was as if she were still there, whispering each sentence in his ear. It was as if that wood, that floor, that place had absorbed his prayers. And maybe they were beginning to blossom now. The letters weren't just about him. They were about Abigail, too. How she had lost everything and yet kept her faith. "She will be your bridge back," read one of the last pages. The next day, Abigail showed up before noon, unannounced. This time she brought cakes, a book of Psalms, and lavender seedlings to plant in the garden. But what caught Jacob's attention most was that she was wearing the white dress she'd worn at her husband's funeral. "Is this a special day?" he asked. She simply smiled. "Yes, but you still don't know why." They spent the day together. They planted in silence, walked through the fields, and when night fell, they sat under the oak tree where his mother used to pray. Abigail opened the Bible in the darkness and recited it from memory. "You count my wanderings. Put my tears in. Your bottle. Are they not in your book?" Her voice was a whisper, weighted with eternity. Jacob was silent for a moment, then said, "My mother believed in miracles. Thought they were for desperate people. But now I'm not so sure." She touched his hand, and he didn't pull away. As the days passed, Abigail returned more often. Sometimes just to leave a cake on the porch. Sometimes to help in the garden. Sometimes just to sit and listen. Jacob began to talk about the lonely nights in Chicago, about his regret at not being with his father at the end, about how he had let his faith turn to dust. Abigail never interrupted. She listened, with the kind of listening that heals, that doesn't judge. And that was exactly what he needed most. One night, after an impromptu dinner by lamplight, Jacob showed her the box of letters. Abigail read some of them silently, holding the pages gently. When she finished, she looked him in the eye and said, "Your mother didn't pray alone. She taught me to pray too. And I prayed for you all these years." Jacob tried to hold back his tears, but it was no use. She hugged him, long, strong, silent, and he felt for the first time in years what it was like to be held without being judged. The ranch began to change along with him. The land seemed more fertile, the air lighter, the animals calmer. Even the well, dry for months, began to drip water again. Jacob said it was a coincidence. Abigail said it was a promise. And deep down, he wasn't so sure anymore, because everything was different. And yet, everything finally seemed right. The ranch was no longer a scene of pain, but home again. And maybe ... just maybe, this was the beginning of something bigger. One night, as the full moon rose in the clear sky, Jacob and Abigail sat in the renovated barn. She spoke softly about her deceased husband, about how she still dreamed of him sometimes. Jacob held her hand tightly and said, "I don't know how much time I have left, but whatever time is left, I want to live truthfully. And you are my truth now." She looked at him, her eyes welling. "Even if the pain returns?" she asked. And he answered without hesitation, "Even then." And then, as if time had held its breath until that moment, they kissed, slowly, reverently, like someone finding shelter after a long storm. It wasn't blind passion, it was conscious love, the kind born of shared pain, of intertwined faith, of respected silence. It was the kind of kiss that seals a pact. And in that moment, there among straws and promises, the world seemed to hold its breath. But little did they know that something was yet to happen, something that neither the cards nor faith could foresee, because the true miracle was yet to be revealed. And the next part will change everything. Prepare your heart. Part 5 is coming, and with it, the impossible. The storm arrived without warning. The sky, which had seemed serene until then, suddenly darkened, as if something unseen was moving. Lightning streaked the horizon, and the wind seemed to scream through the twisted trees. Jacob was in the barn, stacking bales of hay, when the first pain took him by surprise. A sharp stab in his abdomen that shot like fire to his chest. He fell to his knees. His breath became short. Sweat broke out on his forehead. And for the first time since his diagnosis, he thought it was the end. Abigail arrived minutes later, drenched from the rain. She entered the barn and found him hunched over on the ground, his face pale, his hands clutching his chest in despair. "Jacob!" She screamed, running to him. He barely managed to respond. "Go away. Please." She ignored her. She knelt beside him, pulled the Bible from her wet coat, and placed her hand on his chest. Thunder rumbled outside, but her voice, even in a low tone, carried. "God, if there is still purpose in this man, show it now. Heal if it is your will, but be here." Time seemed to stand still. The wind died down for a few seconds. And inside that barn, only Abigail's voice could be heard, a fervent, sincere prayer, cutting through the darkness like a blade of light. Jacob couldn't understand it, but he felt something. Something warm, calm, as if someone had touched him. Inside and said, "Not yet." He blacked out. When he woke, the storm had passed, and Abigail was there, sitting on the dirt floor, holding his hand, her eyes swollen from praying. The next day, Jacob woke up feeling strangely light. The usual pain in his abdomen was gone, nor was the weakness, nor was the dry cough. He walked around the house as if he were walking in a dream. He washed his face, put on his shirt, and went out to feed the animals. And he noticed that even they looked different. The old horse that had been limping for weeks trotted into the pasture. The calf that hadn't eaten in days was nursing. The entire ranch seemed to have awakened with a different energy. Something inexplicable, but Jacob said nothing. Not to Abigail, not to anyone. He didn't know if it was a miracle or a fleeting relief. What if it was just another false hope? He had grown accustomed to losing everything he loved. So he kept his silence like a shield. However, as time passed, more signs appeared. The flowers on the hedge began to bloom again. The well gushed louder, and Abigail's visits became daily. They began doing everything together. They replanted the garden, fixed up the barn, painted the porch. They laughed at simple things. They shared stories. Her presence became his new routine. But even amidst the laughter and glances, Jacob carried the secret of his sudden improvement. And it weighed heavily. At night, he would stare at the ceiling and silently ask, "Is that it? Is it over? Or is this just the beginning of something bigger?" Abigail seemed to feel it. On one of the quieter nights that week, she lit a fire, made mint tea, and said, looking him in the eye, "God doesn't usually give us everything at once. He gives it to us in pieces, for us to cherish." Jacob just nodded, not revealing his feelings. But a part of him wanted to scream, wanted to tell him that his body was different, that there was life where before there was only pain. But the fear of losing it kept him silent. One of the most memorable days happened on a Sunday morning. 6 sheep that had been isolated began to recover without any medication. Even the town veterinarian was surprised. He said he'd never seen anything like it. "It's as if this land has been touched by some ancient blessing," he commented. Jacob listened in silence, and for the first time felt chills, because what he called a coincidence was already too big to deny. That same night, as they were laying new boards in the barn, Abigail looked at him with a slight smile and said, "I don't know what's happening here, Jacob, but I feel it. It's like heaven is closer." He looked away, touched by her words. He thought about kissing her, but he didn't. The fear was still there. The fear that it would all be taken away suddenly. The fear of feeling love, and then watching it slip through his fingers. But deep down, he knew something had changed. It wasn't just his body. It was his soul. And even though he tried to hide it, the sparkle in his eyes wasn't the same. Life had returned, and with it, something deeper, something inexplicable, something only those who have lived it understand. But what Jacob didn't know was that the true test was yet to come. And when it came, not even his growing faith would be enough on its own. So, my friend, are you feeling it? Because what started as a farewell now feels like a rebirth. But be careful, because every light attracts shadows. And in part 6, the past knocks on the door. And with it, a decision that could change everything. Don't miss it. Part 6 will leave you speechless. Not every miracle is immediately accepted, and Jacob was a master at distrusting what was too good to be true. Pain had molded his bones, carved his mind, and sealed his heart in ancient iron. The relief he felt in his body, the energy that was slowly returning, the involuntary smiles with Abigail. All of this frightened him more than the illness. Because if all of this really was a gift from God, he feared he wouldn't be worthy of keeping it. One golden autumn afternoon, as they raked leaves from the orchard, Abigail commented on the early harvest, how even the neighbors noticed the changes on the ranch. Jacob responded with a simple, "Maybe it's just the weather." She paused, holding an orange leaf between her fingers. "Or maybe it's grace." He laughed, but not mockingly, uneasily. "Grace doesn't choose people like me, Abigail." She looked at him deeply. "You don't know the God I know." That night, she returned. She brought with her a small wooden box filled with old letters. They were hers. Letters she had written to her deceased husband, even after his death. Jacob read them in silence, each word charged with love, grief, anger, and faith mixed like wine and blood. "I screamed at God, but he didn't turn his back on me," she said. "It was there, in the midst of my rebellion, that he taught me to carry on." Jacob swallowed hard. For the first time, he felt he wasn't alone in the desert. The following days were like leaves in the wind. They laughed more. They divided tasks as if time were infinite. Sometimes Abigail slept in the living room chair with Jacob's mother's, embroidery draped over her lap. He would watch, silent, trying to understand how a woman who had lost so much could still love so much. And it was in this silent love that Jacob found himself slowly disarming. But the closer he got to peace, the more fear whispered in the darkness. That one Sunday, she took him to the small chapel in town. He hesitated, but went. He sat in the back row, head bowed, hands clasped as if holding his breath. The pastor spoke of resurrection, not of the dead, but of the still breathing. "There are souls dead among us," he said, "and God has not forgotten them." Jacob felt a lump in his throat, but he refused to cry. Abigail simply held his hand. No rush, no pressure. On the way back, she commented on the sermon. She said she believed Jacob was being called back to life, not only in body, but in spirit. "What if it's all imagination?" he asked. "What if my improvement is just a coincidence?" Abigail paused, and in a firm voice said, "Jacob, there are coincidences that make flowers bloom where there were stones. There are coincidences that restore faith to those who had already buried their souls. If this is coincidence, then it's good that God works with them." One silent night, Jacob had a nightmare. He relived the scene of the fight with his father, the screams, the slamming of the door, the silence of guilt, the news of death too late. He woke in a panic. Abigail ran to him and found him sweating, breathing heavily. "It was my fault, everything I left," he murmured. She hugged him tightly. "Pain doesn't define you. Returning does. And you came back, Jacob. This is redemption." From that day on, something changed between them. It wasn't spoken, but it was felt. An invisible alliance, sealed in nights of vigil, unexpected laughter, and hands intertwined in the simplest tasks. It was love, but a love that hadn't yet been given. A name. It was a care that healed, a faith borrowed from Abigail to keep Jacob standing. And even though he still resisted the term miracle, his body, his soul, and the ranch already knew something divine was at work there. Abigail wrote a verse on the bathroom mirror with lipstick. "Behold, I make all things new." Jacob read it silently for days. Then one morning he wrote in pen next to it, "Even those who do not believe?" When Abigail saw it, she simply replied with a note, "Especially these." And so, between faith and resistance, between the ground and the sky, a new Jacob began to be born. Still conflicted, still suspicious, but for the first time, open. But fate always tests before confirming. And there was something on the horizon, something that would come not to destroy, but to prove how far the miracle could go. And I warn you, dear listener, Part 7 is where the impossible knocks on the door, and nothing will be the same again. Sometimes what's frightening isn't the pain ... It's the absence of it. Jacob woke on one of those days when the Montana sky seems hand-painted. His body felt light, his chest ached, and his breathing was deeper than it had been years. But the strangest thing wasn't his well-being, it was his constancy. It had been weeks since his last attack. No twinges, no fever, no tremors. Just the silence of the miracle slowly approaching, while he pretended not to notice. Abigail, on the other hand, noticed everything. The color in his face, the way he walked more steadily, his eyes brighter. But she said nothing. She simply discreetly noted every change, every piece of evidence, every small breath of life that disproved the previous diagnosis. Until one late afternoon, between one harvest and another, she stopped, wiped her hands on her apron, and said, "It's time to see a doctor, Jacob." He froze. "Why?" he pretended. But she didn't smile, because God works in the unseen. But sometimes he likes to leave evidence. It was Dr. Henry Wallace who answered, an old acquaintance from the town. He had steady hands and the eyes of a seasoned skeptic. When he saw Jacob, he raised his eyebrows. "I thought you'd already moved on, son." Jacob laughed awkwardly. "I thought so too." The tests were performed with precision. Blood, lung, ultrasound, CT scan. In the end, the doctor's silence was more deafening than any results. He sat before them, his face pale. "There are no more signs of the disease." Jacob didn't know how to react. His brain tried to find explanations. Misdiagnosis, lab error, spontaneous remission. But his body just cried. Abigail held his hand tightly, her eyes shining, but without arrogance, only gratitude. "It's not possible," the doctor repeated. "I saw the previous reports. There's no error. But now, there's nothing." The office seemed too small to contain that moment. Word spread quickly. Bozeman was small, and the Miller surname still carried respect. Within days, neighbors were talking at the markets, at church, at the barbershop. "Did you hear? Miller's son was healed." It was God. It had to be. They say the woman who cares for him is a saint. And so the ranch, once a reminder of abandonment, began to be spoken of in hushed tones, as a place of miracles. But Jacob, he didn't know how to cope. The joy many expected from him didn't come as easily as they imagined. He withdrew into himself. He spent hours in the fields, in silence. Sometimes he would stare at the fireplace for hours, as if searching for an answer there. The faith he had mocked, ignored, discredited, now surrounded him on all sides. And the question that tormented him was, why me? Why would God heal someone like him? So distant, so skeptical, so broken? Abigail respected his silence. But one night, with the rain falling softly on the roof, she came over, sat beside him on the sofa, and said, "You don't need to understand now. Just accept it. God doesn't heal because we deserve it. He heals because he loves." Jacob looked into her eyes, lost and emotional. "But what if I fall again? What if it's just for a while?" She smiled tenderly. "Then I'll be here, holding your hand, until the end or until the beginning." That same night, Jacob went to the barn. He carried one of his mother's letters. He lit a candle and prayed. Out loud, for the first time, the words came out broken, shaky, but true. "I don't know why the Lord chose me, but I'm here. I won't run away anymore." And it was at that exact moment he later recounted that he smelled lavender, strong, warm, as if his mother were still there, smiling silently. The next day was bustling. People arrived at the ranch gate. Simple folk, curious, sick, desperate. Some asked for prayers. Others just wanted to see with their own eyes the man who had returned from the brink of death. Abigail welcomed them sweetly. Jacob, at first, was uncomfortable, but soon he understood that when God acts, testimony becomes a mission. And what he thought was the end was just a calling, but not everyone accepted it so easily. A pastor from out of town began to cast doubt. He said miracles didn't come from ordinary men, that it could be a mistake, heresy, and this affected Jacob more than he would have liked. The doubt returned, the shame, the fear of making a mistake again. Abigail hugged him tightly that night and said, "The enemy always barks louder when he knows victory is near." And then she kissed him. It was a firm kiss, not one of fleeting passion, but of someone who chooses to love, even when the other hasn't yet forgiven themselves. "I love you, Jacob Miller," she whispered, "not because you were healed, but because you chose to live. And loving someone who chooses to live is the purest gift anyone can have." Jacob didn't answer, but her tears were the answer. And faith finally stopped resisting. But every intense light attracts shadow, and something was about to happen. Something that would test everything. Part 8 will shake the ground beneath your feet. Don't miss it. The miracle was just the beginning. Now comes the test. Miracles can heal the body, but what about the soul? Jacob thought feeling well physically was enough to move forward. But when people began showing up at the gate with photos of loved ones, Bibles in hand, and prayer requests, something inside him snapped. It was as if everyone suddenly expected him to be a saint, a prophet, a living sign. But Jacob was still just a broken man trying to rebuild himself, and the pressure began to suffocate. One cold morning, he left. He left a simple note on the table. "I need silence. I need to think. Forgive me." He got in his truck and drove for hours along Montana roads until he found an old cabin in the mountains where he used to fish with his father. There, among the pines and the piercing silence, he sought answers, or perhaps permission to doubt. And there, without Abigail, without the ranch, without the hubbub of people, the emptiness felt even heavier than he remembered. Abigail knew where to find him. She knew Jacob beyond words, and she knew that behind his silence lurked a scream. It was late afternoon, with the sky painted lead. Her truck pulled up slowly, and when she got out, Jacob was sitting on the porch steps, his gaze lost on the horizon. "I knew you would come," he said without turning his head. "Then why did you run away?" she asked. The answer took a while, but came with force. "Because I don't know if I'm the man everyone thinks I am. I didn't ask to be anyone's miracle." She came over, sat beside him, and was silent for a moment. And she said calmly, "You're not a miracle. You're someone who's been touched by one. And that doesn't make you less of a man. It makes you more human." Jacob lowered his head, his eyes brimming with tears. "I'm afraid to believe, because if I do, and fall again, it will hurt twice as much." Abigail cupped his face firmly with both hands. "Running away from faith is like running away from life, Jacob, and life has already called you back." The pain he carried was deeper than any examination could reveal. It was the pain of unspoken guilt, of unlived love, of hope buried alive. But there, with Abigail, he allowed himself. He let the tears flow. "I didn't want to fall in love with you," he confessed, "because loving again is risking yourself again, and I've already lost too much." She didn't respond with words. She responded with a kiss, slow, firm, redeeming. That kiss wasn't an escape. It was a return, a silent pact between two hearts that had learned to lose, but now chose to stay. When they parted, Abigail rested her forehead against his and whispered, "Staying isn't weakness. It's courage." Jacob closed his eyes and finally accepted it. Not just the healing, but the love, the faith, the new chance heaven had given him, even if he didn't think he deserved it. The next morning, they returned to Bozeman together. The ranch welcomed them with the same silence it always offered, but there was something different in the air. The gate no longer felt like a boundary, but a gateway. The animals came to meet them. The flowering fields seemed grateful, and the townspeople respected them. There was no mass welcome, just discreet smiles, looks of hope, and silent hugs. Jacob gathered the strength to step onto the pulpit of the small church and tell his story, not as a miracle, but as a man. "I was healed in body, yes," he said, "but the greatest miracle was finding my soul again. And that I owe to my mothers. Faith, Abigail's courage, and the hand of a God who never stopped seeing me, even when I stopped believing." The church applauded, but the most important applause came from his heart. For the first time, he felt whole. Abigail stood at the temple door, holding hands with him. When a child came to ask to pray for her sick mother, Jacob knelt with her. They prayed together, simply, without promises, only with faith. And there, on the cold church floor, he understood that his mission was not to carry miracles on his shoulders, but to be a bridge for others to believe that they are still possible. That night, under the starry Bozeman sky, as they lay on the ranch porch, Abigail pressed against his chest. Jacob whispered, "You brought me back." And she replied, "It wasn't me. It was love." And that was when he understood. The miracle wasn't surviving. It was choosing to live. And that he would do every day with Abigail by his side. But before you think this story is over, know that heaven had one more surprise in store, and part 9 will show that even the strongest love can be challenged. Get ready. The new beginning is still being written. When God heals a man, it's not just for him. It's for what he will become later. And Jacob became an answer. It wasn't overnight, but with Abigail's steady hands and the quiet strength of rediscovered faith, the old Miller Ranch ceased to be a place of mourning and became a sanctuary of hope. The house took on new colors. The barn became a welcoming space, the porch filled with benches and flowers. And the land, the same land where he thought he would die, now pulsed with life for those who no longer had a place to live. It was Abigail's idea. "What if we open the ranch to those who've lost hope?" she asked one night. A map of the region spread out on the table. Jacob hesitated for a second, then smiled with his eyes. "Let's give to others what life has given us back." And so they began, little by little. A clean room, a wooden bed with a quilt embroidered by his mother, hot soup, a leisurely prayer. And whoever arrived felt it. It was different. Something in the air, something in the soil, something in the spirit of that place. The first people to arrive were neighbors. An elderly man suffering from depression, a mother who had lost a son, a young man undergoing cancer treatment. They weren't looking for a miracle cure. They were looking for peace, and they found it. Abigail organized nightly vigils with candles and soft hymns. Jacob walked among the guests, coffee in hand, eyes locked. "There's no rush here," he said. "Here, there's only hugs." The town began to support. The bakery sent bread. The school donated books for silent reading. Young people came to help in the garden. Pastors from different churches took turns praying. And what began as pain became purpose. The Ranch of Forgotten Miracles, as they began to call it, became a beacon for those walking in the shadows. And Jacob, without realizing it, became a symbol. But he always made a point of repeating, "The miracle is not me. The miracle is the love that doesn't give up on us." Abigail blossomed beside him, not just as a wife, they hadn't married yet, but as a soul mate. She cared for people like one tends seeds. She knew what to say, when to be silent, when to embrace. And at night, after everyone was asleep, they would walk among the trees with their fingers intertwined, exchanging silences deeper than words. "Are you still afraid?" she asked once. "I am," Jacob replied. "But now I have you, and that changes everything." Together, they wrote a book containing Jacob's mother's letters, visitors' testimonies, and verses that had sustained them. The book circulated to churches, support centers, and even hospitals. A Chicago doctor, the same one who diagnosed him, called, overcome with emotion. "I don't understand how, but I'm glad I was wrong." Jacob just smiled. "The Lord understood. More than you think, doctor. You just need to let your soul hear." But it wasn't all joy. Caring for the wounded requires carrying crosses. There were nights of mourning, losses that came even with prayer. And on each of them, Jacob sat alone under the oak tree, the same one where his mother prayed and let the tears fall. "Why do some stay and others don't?" he asked, and Abigail's soft voice always came in the background, because the greatest miracle isn't living longer. It's living with meaning. On a special afternoon, the town organized a gathering at the ranch. It was the 2-year anniversary of the ranch's reopening. Over 100 people came. Candles were lit, songs were sung, and children ran through the field. And Jacob, overcome with emotion, climbed onto a small makeshift stage. "I was a man who lost everything," he said. "And when I thought my end was certain, God gave me back my life. But more than that, He gave me a why." After the speech, when he came downstairs, Abigail was waiting for him with a tight smile and full eyes. "You were made for this," she said, "to be shelter." And it was there, in front of everyone, that Jacob knelt and took a simple velvet box from his pocket. "Do you want to continue being my mission until the end?" Abigail laughed through her tears. "Since the first loaf of bread I left on that porch, Jacob Miller, yes. The chapel bells rang that night, even though no one pulled the rope. No one explained, no one wanted to, because everything was a sign. And the ranch, once forgotten, was now a living reminder that heaven still touched earth. But there was one last page to be written, one last gift from heaven, something no one expected, and that would change the course of this story forever, and you won't want to miss it. Part 10... will reveal the miracle no one saw coming. Hold on tight, because the end is just the beginning. Years had passed since that first prayer said on the dirt floor of the barn, and Jacob Miller was still there, alive, strong enough to push his grandchildren's swing under the ancient oak tree where his mother, decades before, had prayed for a lost son. Time had done its work on his body. It's true. Gray hair, scarred hands, slower steps. But his eyes, Oh, his eyes still held the same sparkle as when heaven decided not to give up. The Miller Ranch was no longer just a home. It was a living sanctuary, a place where families found refuge, where stories of resilience blossomed like lavender in the fields, and where Sundays were marked by prayer circles, homemade bread, and children running barefoot in the wet earth. The vegetable garden flourished year-round. The barn now housed libraries and greenhouses, and the porch served as a stage for weddings, baptisms, and faith-filled farewells. Abigail grew old alongside Jacob with the same grace with which she lived, firm as a tree, sweet as the tea she served on cold afternoons. She still sang hymns at dusk and prayed with her hands clasped when no one was looking. It was her idea to transform the back room into a small nursery for children rescued from difficult situations. Every beginning deserves a hug, she would say, and there many found their new beginning. Jacob wrote letters now, no longer to himself nor to the past, but to those who arrived. Each guest received a handwritten letter from him with a verse, a story, and a promise. You are not alone. He said it was his way of repaying what his mother had done for him, even after her death. And every time he sat on the porch with pen and paper, he would say quietly, "I'm still writing, Mom. I'm still here." Doctors had already stopped trying to understand. Jacob's case was presented at conferences, in articles, and in interviews, but he never wanted the spotlight. He always said that the true miracle wasn't the end of the disease. It was the end of the escape. Coming home was the greatest gift of my life, he repeated. No matter how far you wander, God always remembers the way back. One summer afternoon, while the grandchildren played in the mud of the barnyard and the adults prepared bread for the town fair, Jacob and Abigail sat side by side on the porch. They were silent, as they always were when they didn't need to say anything. She held his hand tenderly and said, "Remember the first white rose that appeared here?" He smiled, as if I'd forgotten. That was the first sign that heaven still sees us. The sun slowly sank below the horizon, painting the mountains with hues of gold and rust. And there, with the sound of children's laughter in the background, Jacob closed his eyes for a moment. "Do you think we still have much time?" he asked. Abigail replied with the same serene tone as always. "The time that matters is the time we dedicate, and ours ... was all of it." He squeezed her hand tightly, because in that moment he knew it had all been worth it. I, Wyatt McCall, who have followed this story from the very beginning, can tell you this. The true miracle wasn't Jacob's body overcoming cancer. It was him coming back, forgiving, loving, believing. Because sometimes the miracle isn't what changes the sentence, but what transforms the soul. And that kind of miracle, ... doesn't die. It leaves roots. Today, Rancho dos Milagres Esquicios is a living reminder of what should never have been forgotten, that faith, love, and return are the most enduring cures. And if you've come this far with me, it's because a part of you also needed to remember this. So tell me in the comments, do you believe in new beginnings? Because if you do, you already have everything you need to live yours. And if this story touched your heart in any way, if it reminded you of someone, made you want to return to something you left behind, or simply rekindled a spark of faith within you, then leave your comment below. I want to know which part of this story moved you the most. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now's the time. Click here, because here you'll always find stories like this that warm, that inspire, that heal. Stories of love that endures, of faith that blossoms where least expected, and of miracles that no one can explain, but that we feel. And remember to activate the bell, because the next story is already being written. And I can promise you, It will surprise you. Until then, take care of your heart and keep believing, because anyone who hears stories like these already carries within them the beginning of a miracle. See you soon. Until the next story.